Does eating fats make you fat? On the surface, it seems so. Go to any supermarket in any part of the world, and you will see rows and rows of low-fat or zero-fat alternatives of milk, yogurt, biscuits, cookies, breakfast cereal, salad dressing, cheese, the list goes on. The term low-fat has become synonymous with health. Most people believe that they got fat by eating fats, but actually eating low-fat or zero-fat alternatives can make you gain more unhealthy weight. Ever since the low-fat food has become popular, the rate of obesity and cardiovascular diseases have increased in most countries. So let's talk about why you think low-fat food is healthy, how this lie was propagated in popular culture, and what were the effects of this misplaced belief on our health. Our story begins with a charismatic doctor, Dr. Ancel Keys. Dr. Ancel Keys was a celebrated American physiologist. He had two claims to fame in his name. First, he developed the K ration during the Second World War for American soldiers. And second, in the 1960s, he hypothesized that fats are the major cause of heart diseases, or in other words, eating fats makes you fat. Both of these inventions were later found to be much less scientific than were initially imagined. First, let's talk about the K ration. In 1941, Ancel Keys was assigned by the US War Department to design a non-perishable, ready-to-eat meal that could fit in a soldier's pocket. So Ancel Keys went to a local supermarket to choose foods that would be inexpensive but still be enough to provide energy. And just like that, he concocted the K ration. In total, one K ration contained 3,200 kilocalories. He then tested these K ration meals on 6 soldiers. Because of the short duration and hasty nature of testing of these K rations, Ancel Keys did not realize the simple fact that soldiers fighting, digging, and marching in the real war conditions would require many more calories per day. And then he also included 4 cigarettes with each K ration. I can only imagine how many soldiers got tobacco addiction and hence lifelong bad health conditions because of those 4 Chesterfields every day. But then we can't blame Dr. Ancel Keys entirely for the cigarettes because in those days even well-trained doctors recommended cigarettes to the general public. But his second invention proved to be much more dangerous than the K ration and its cigarettes. He had hypothesized that saturated fats are making people more prone to cardiovascular diseases such as heart attacks, etc. Now, in the scientific process, proposing a hypothesis is not bad at all. Actually, proposing a hypothesis is the first step in any scientific discovery. So there's nothing wrong with him proposing this idea. But his approach in trying to prove his hypothesis to be correct was a bit too unscientific. In post-war America, Ancel Keys was perplexed by a seemingly counterintuitive observation. American business executives, presumably among the best-fed people, had high rates of heart disease, while in post-war Europe, still grappling with reduced food supplies, heart disease rates had plummeted sharply. And then suddenly, on September 23, 1955, the then US President Eisenhower suffered the first of a series of heart attacks. This event brought America's attention to the heart disease pandemic, and Ancel Keys proposed a hypothesis ready for a nation grappling with the cardiovascular disease pandemic. In November of the same year, at an expert meeting at the World Health Organization in Geneva, Ancel Keys proposed his hypothesis that fats contain cholesterol and cholesterol causes heart disease. He didn't have any research-based, verified proof of this hypothesis, and as part of his argument to prove his hypothesis correct, he presented a correlation between deaths from heart disease and percentage of fat in diet in 6 countries. Now, if you look at the data of the 6 countries that he presented, it does look like a diet rich in fats is responsible for the cardiovascular disease pandemic. But in reality, Dr. Keys had cherry-picked these 6 countries out of a total cohort of 22 countries. He concealed the data from the other 16 countries. But why would he do that? If you look at the data of all 22 countries, you can see no correlation between heart disease and saturated fat consumption. For example, people from France and Netherlands have a high saturated fat consumption and very little incidence of heart disease. But on the other hand, people from Finland and Australia have a high saturated fat consumption and a very high incidence of heart disease. So it's crystal clear that there's no correlation between heart disease and saturated fat consumption. This cherry picking of just 18% of the total data shows an extreme lack of intellectual honesty and research integrity on Ancel Keys' part. But luck was on the side of Ancel Keys. How? Well, after Eisenhower's heart attacks, Dr. Paul Dudley White was appointed a personal physician of the president. Now, Dr. White happened to be a good friend of Ancel Keys. They both enjoyed vacations in southern Italy. This friendship with Dr. White gave Ancel Keys the access to financial support from many US government agencies to prove his hypothesis. With Dr. White's approval, Keys placed Eisenhower on his experimental, heart-friendly, low-fat, prudent diet. The outcomes were not good. Eisenhower developed type 2 diabetes, suffered a stroke, had multiple heart attacks, and died from intractable heart failure. Keys' heart-healthy diet contributed significantly to the death of President Eisenhower, but this connection was never made public. Anyways, in 1957, Ancel Keys tried to convince the American Heart Association to adopt his fats cause heart attacks hypothesis, but AHA didn't agree with him and maintained that experimental studies needed to be done in order to find if Keys' hypothesis was correct or wrong. In 1958, he got a massive, unheard of $2 million government funding. Then in 1961, the American Heart Association suddenly recommended reducing saturated fat and cholesterol intake from foods such as butter, egg yolks, and full-fat milk, and replacing them with low-fat alternatives and seed oils. Now, why did AHA have this sudden change of heart from its 1957 stance? The simple reason was that during these 4 years, Ancel Keys was added to the board of AHA, and given his growing clout, he dominated the Dietary Guidelines Committee of AHA, where he ignored the voice of alternative theories which suspected sugars and refined carbohydrates for the increasing rate of heart diseases in America. On 13th January 1961, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine. That was a big deal. Now, Ancel Keys and his hypothesis became so popular that the alternative theories, such as eating sugars makes you fat, was ignored by the press and, more importantly, by the funding agencies. The public accepted Ancel Keys' hypothesis as the final truth. From 1968 to 1973, Keys and Ivan Franz initiated a large randomized controlled trial where saturated fats were replaced by unsaturated oils in people's diets. But the results were never published in the press. Why? The results of this study proved Ancel Keys' hypothesis wrong. The trial had concluded that although replacement of saturated fats with unsaturated oils effectively lowers the cholesterol in the blood, but this lowering of the blood cholesterol does not lower the risk of death from coronary heart disease. So, long story short, Ancel Keys did his best to convince the general public as well as the government agencies that it was saturated fats that made people fat, despite finding that it's simply not true. At the same time, he actively suppressed any alternative hypotheses. But despite all the clout and charisma of Ancel Keys, a British physiologist, Dr. John Yudkin, tried to bring our attention to a mounting body of evidence that suggested that it just might be the sugars and not the fats that's making us fat. Around the end of the Second World War, in the UK, Dr. John Yudkin was also trying to understand why people were suddenly getting obese and dying from heart disease in affluent countries. And given the dramatic increase in sugar consumption during the first half of the century, Yudkin started to suspect that excessive sugar in the diet might be the real culprit. Studying historical data, he found that increasing prosperity always leads to an increase in sugar consumption, particularly in manufactured foods. What happens is people leave their traditional food habits and instead start consuming more of the readily available factory-made food, which is usually very rich in their sugar content. Food companies were adding a lot of sugar in their factory-manufactured food items. Why? Sugar made from heavily subsidized corn was much cheaper than other ingredients for the food companies. It added more weight to the final product and drove up profit margins for food manufacturers. In 1964, Yudkin noted that in the wealthier countries, there is evidence that sugar and sugar-containing foods contribute to several diseases, including obesity, dental caries, diabetes, and heart attacks. He and his associates found that patients with plaque in their arteries consumed significantly more sugar than the control group. In another experiment, Yudkin fed both experimental animals and human volunteers with different quantities of sugar. As a result, Yudkin suggested that the excessive consumption of sugar might result in a disturbance in the secretion of insulin, and that this in turn might contribute to plaque in the arteries as well as diabetes. In 1972, Yudkin wrote the book titled Pure, White and Deadly. He wanted to make the general public aware of the evidence that consumption of sugar was leading to a greatly increased incidence of blockage of arteries, obesity, diabetes, and liver disease. Yudkin explained in the beginning of the book, "I hope that when you have read this book, I shall have convinced you that sugar is really dangerous." The message was extremely unwelcome to the sugar industry, and these firms employed a number of methods to impede Yudkin's work. The final chapter of Pure, White and Deadly lists several examples of attempts to interfere with the funding of his research and to prevent its publication. It also refers to the bitter language and personal smears on Yudkin by Ancel. So, how exactly did the sugar industry try to impede Yudkin's discovery? In 2016, researchers discovered that the sugar industry paid scientists in the 1960s to play down the link between sugar and heart disease and promote saturated fat as the culprit instead. The documents show that in 1964, John Hickson, a top sugar industry executive, discussed a plan with others in the industry to shift public opinion about the mounting evidence of relationship between high sugar diets and the country's high rate of heart disease. So, a trade group called the Sugar Research Foundation, today known as the Sugar Association, paid 3 Harvard scientists about $60,000 in today's money to publish a review of research on sugar, fat, and heart disease. The studies used in the review were handpicked by the Sugar Group. The Harvard scientists were asked to underplay the link between sugar and heart disease and instead exaggerate Ancel hypothesized role of saturated fat in heart disease. The 3 scientists did exactly that. As they worked on their review, the Harvard researchers shared and discussed early drafts with Mr. Hickson, who responded that he was pleased with what they were writing. The article was published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine in 1967. In the final draft of the article, the 3 Harvard scientists had dismissed the data on sugar being behind the heart diseases as weak and had given far more credence to the data implicating saturated fats for the heart disease epidemic. After the review was published, the debate about sugar connected with heart disease died down. The effort to discredit the case against sugar was largely successful. That's the problem with industry-funded research, isn't it? Anyways, the net result of all this was that the market saw an increased demand for low-fat or zero-fat alternatives of milk and other dairy products. But even after the low-fat diet became the norm, obesity rates kept on rising. Why was that the case? Because food tastes bad when you remove natural fat from it. So to make it tasty again, food companies add sugar to it. Remember, sugar is very, very cheap thanks to the massive corn subsidies that still exist. As a result, the consumption of sugars has skyrocketed to about 126.4 grams daily per person in the US. That's more than 10 times the recommended 11 grams per day. Today, scientists know very well that cholesterol is not the demon that Ancel tried to portray it was. And we know that the main culprit is the excessive sugar we eat, and it is highly addictive. Once you get used to high amount of sugar in your diet, it's not easy to get rid of it. So, what's the takeaway from all this? In one sentence, sugar is bad for your teeth, heart, and liver. Overconsumption of sugars leads to increased chances of diabetes, chronic body inflammation, and heart attack. Most stored fat in your body is formed not from the naturally occurring fats that you eat in foods, but when the liver converts the excess unneeded sugars into glycogen and stores it as fat. So basically, the fat that you see deposited on your body is nothing but excess sugar. Now, of course, we know that trans fats are bad for our health. And so I'm sure you do look at trans fat content on the food labels. But if you want to be healthier, the more important thing is to be more cautious, much more cautious about the amount of sugars and refined carbohydrates present in the foods. So next time you check the nutritional information on a pack of food or beverage, don't forget to count sugar content, because most probably it's that sugar that's going to go inside of your body and convert into fat. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye.